So maybe I'll just introduce myself also before we can start this session. So my name is Frank Odhiambo. I'm Kenyan. I'm actually in Kenya at the moment, but currently I'm a doctoral student at ETH Zurich in Switzerland, where I do my PhD. I'm now in my second year of the PhD. I'm also a co-founder of the GAIN initiative. Get excited to see the GAIN initiative grow this fast, this far. And we are really excited to have you join. About GAIN, so GAIN is the Graduate Applications International Network. So GAIN supports prospective graduate students from all countries across Africa who are interested in applying to programs, both masters and PhD. And our goal essentially is to strengthen the pipeline of African students. So actually the background for starting GAIN, co-founded together with Professor Dina Pomeranz of the University of Zurich and Adina Rohn, that because I worked for Innovations for Poverty Action in Kenya, and we were quite worried that most of the scholars who study like economic questions, even in Africa itself, were mostly researchers from the West, so either from Europe or the US or North America in general. While there's very few scholars from Africa who are actually like doing any sort of work in Africa. So this is kind of like the background for starting the GAIN initiative. And we have like several research organizations, including JPAL, IPA, et cetera, that already have like a great pipeline of African scholars or potential African scholars. So we thought about like starting this initiative to kind of like build the pipeline for African scholars who are interested in joining the economics profession. So that's kind of like the broad of why GAIN existed in the first place. And maybe just to speak a bit more about this. So of course, then why is GAIN important is that in spite of the fact that there's a very low pipeline of African scholars joining the economics profession, there's also actually like significant hurdles that African students face when trying to actually like get into the economics profession. And all of these hurdles range from applications, so it could be like financial. Many students have no idea that they actually like have a very good profile to get into an economics master or PhD program. So the idea behind GAIN is to kind of smoothen this I would say like information asymmetries and also like financial constraints to allow more African students pursue these sort of programs in top programs across the globe. There are 4 different options that you could potentially apply to as a, and so these are the 4 different options that are available for you. The first one is the master's programs, which tend to be between 1 and 2 years long, depending on the program and also depending on the university of the school that you go to. And usually, of course, the master's program usually is not sufficient for an academic career. So if you want to get into teaching, if you want to become a professor, then of course a master's program is not sufficient for you to get to this. So you need to go beyond that to get in an academic career. So there's also sometimes defined focus. There are some master's programs that are specifically tailored for those who want to get to a PhD program. So it's kind of like a preparation master's program to kind of like prepare you as a student to then apply to a PhD programs. While there are those ones that are more terminal and they're more policy oriented. So this is for those who are looking to go no further than the master's programs. You're looking at something that's more policy oriented to finish your master's program and get into policy or practice. So, I mean, yeah, the master's program is kind of like, so you need to know that there's a different focus. So when you scope through the different programs that you're applying to, if you are looking for a terminal PhD, it's probably a bad idea to apply to the PhDs that are focused on preparing applicants to the PhD, because 1, you're unlikely to get accepted if you put in your statement of purpose that you are not thinking about an academic career, then they will almost certainly reject your application, and vice versa. I mean, if you mention to a program that's more policy oriented that you're trying to do this and then go to do a PhD, then they're like, okay, maybe not, but I think it's more adverse if you're applying to a master's program that prepares you to the PhD, and then mention in your statement of purpose that you are thinking through like a policy-oriented program, like career. Afterwards, you're more likely, very strongly likely to be rejected. And like I said, sorry, most master's programs, an overwhelming proportion of them typically require you to have external funding or to get scholarships to support with the master's program. So if you're going to apply to master's programs, you really need to be aware that you will spend extra effort trying to scope for funding opportunities or for scholarship opportunities. And also the timing of them is quite important so that you make sure that you put in your applications at a timeline that allows you then to apply for these scholarships. So for most of the master's programs, they're not funded. There are a few that are funded, but if you're going to apply to master's programs, you have to expect that for some part of it, you have to find external funding. And then they're also often required for PhD programs outside of the continent. So especially, like I mentioned, if you are applying as an African student, then many programs will actually require that you have a master's program before you apply to the PhD. The US specifically doesn't necessarily require you to have a master's degree before you apply to the PhD, but as an African student, also depending on the school that you went to and the sort of signal that it sends of the quality of that program, it's really difficult for you to apply without a master's degree to get admitted into a PhD degree. I mean, so this is also something that you probably need to think about. Then we have another option, which is called the pre-doc. This is also typically usually 1 to 2 years long. The pre-doc is a pre-doctoral program. So it's kind of like a program that you do before getting into a doctoral program. And Constantine is one person, for example, who's done a pre-doc or working with Dina Pomeranz the last few years. And usually the minimum eligibility requirement is a bachelor's degree. Many of professors hiring pre-docs usually require that you have prior coding experience, for example, in Stata or R or Python, but at least you need to have some coding experience. Many of the professors that hire actually give you a coding exercise to kind of gauge whether you're a right fit for a pre-doc position. And they're usually mostly based at universities or research institutions, and you get a salary or a stipend together with benefits. So usually when you're hired as a pre-doc at a university or a research institute, you essentially enjoy the benefits of being a salaried employee of the university or the research institute. And it's also a good opportunity to gain education training and mentoring because you tend to work with either an academic or a researcher. So you get the sort of experience working with a mentor who then prepares, also supports you in your application. Actually, many of pre-doc, I would say professors tend to also be letter writers for you when you're applying to programs. So it's also a potential thing that you can think about. It's more of working and less of studying, but the experience you get from working very closely and one-on-one with a professor sort of places you in a good place to then apply to a PhD program and really hopefully get successful at your applications. So then the third option, we have PhD programs at graduate schools. So this is what many people are probably aware about when you apply to a PhD program in a university. They tend to be 3 to 5 years long. Of course, it's the highest degree for academic or policy career. Lately, there's a lot of conversations about people finishing their PhDs and going to policy careers. That's usually an option. Of course, the PhD is mostly tailored for an academic career. So of course, if you have the PhD or if you apply to the PhD, then you are mostly thinking about going into an academic career. Many of them tend to be research oriented. So you will have to do some research and write several papers or a thesis or whatnot. Many of them are offered with funding. I would say an overwhelming proportion of these programs come with funding. We actually highly discourage applicants from applying to PhD programs that do not come with funding, because there are 3 to 5 years of you trying to earn an income and also studying is quite impractical for an African student going abroad. So we strongly encourage that you apply to PhD programs that come with funding. Luckily, most of the programs usually actually come with funding, so that's a good thing. The PhD is required to be a professor at most universities. That's already what I mentioned under the academic career. The PhD programs at graduate schools also tend to require this standardized application process where you'll have materials and they have like a deadline where you have to submit your application, you have to fill in this form online from the programs, and they typically accept several students in one go rather than just one person. So if you think about like applying to a program where they have a deadline and they're accepting several students, this is probably likely to be a PhD at a graduate school. And typically, you take coursework during the first 1 or 2 years of the program. So in the first 1 or 2 years, you are mostly taking classes and almost doing nothing else besides just taking classes and exams for your PhD. Then the latter 3 years, especially most of the coursework takes 2 years actually. Then the rest of the 3 years, you're working on your research that then informs the paper or the thesis that you write in the end. Then the fourth option is what we call the PhD at chairs. So I think this is mostly prevalent in the European setup for many European universities, where we have chairs hiring PhD students. Actually, my PhD itself is a PhD at a chair rather than the typical grad school PhD. So what's the difference to the other PhDs? That these applications tend to be all year round. Contrary to the PhD at grad school, you have to apply at a certain deadline, and the only other time you can apply is when they open the next cycle of applications, while PhDs at chairs tend to be more open. So there's no deadline specifically each year for you to apply, and applications usually are accepted all year long. So there is close cooperation that's expected with the professor and their research. In some cases, when you apply for PhDs at a chair, the chair already has a research, I would say, topic or agenda that they want you to pursue, either jointly with them or potentially independently. But then there's that expectation of a very close cooperation with the researcher or the professor working on their research and also supporting with some of the tasks that the chair might have of you to perform. So it's sometimes it's possible that the chair already has funding for the PhD with a specific topic in mind for you to work on, while sometimes there's also like an open, it's kind of like open what you want to work on. So for example, for my PhD, it was pretty open. I mean, we still had to agree with my advisor what I will work on for the PhD, but it was pretty open. I could have decided between like topic A and topic B, while in other cases, the chair already has a specific funding for a specific project, and they're looking for a PhD student to then pursue that research agenda to its end. In this case, you don't have a lot of flexibility, and you really have to work with the topic that, the chair already has funding for. The professors hire individuals to work on their team. You tend to have a fixed salary. This is, I mean, also for the PhDs, you typically have a salary in any case. They typically have less coursework or structured programs. So there is no, unlike the standard PhD program at a grad school, you're not necessarily taking classes in the first in the first 1 to 2 years of your PhD. So there's typically less coursework. It's less structured. You decide what courses you want to take in the university or another university. While in the PhD at the grad school, there's usually already like a set of, these are required course modules that you have to take. You have to take a few additional ones, but there's also already like a standard set of modules that you have to take and also pass. Otherwise, you're not able to move on beyond the coursework. So in this case, for PhDs at chairs, practical experience can be more taken into account. So of course, if you already have, since you're doing less of coursework and more of research, practical experience managing or doing research is actually pretty much appreciated if you want to apply to PhDs at the chairs. Okay, so that's the difference between the 4 grad school options that you can apply to as part of the GAIN initiative. And we'll have individual sessions talking through each one of these at their time. So next, maybe we speak about the application components. So the first part, of course, is to prepare your application. This is standard for all applicants, whether you're applying to a master's program or a PhD program. The initial step is to decide the program selection. So what field you want to apply to? Is it economics? Is it political science? Is it health economics, etc., etc. So you need to decide the field that you're going to apply to. Is it public policy? Is it financial economics, etc.? So this is what we mean by identifying the field. Then the next step is to identify whether you're applying to master's or PhD programs. So this is also something that you have to think about. You could decide to apply to some master's and some PhD programs. This is a strategy that I used myself. But if you're more of like, okay, I'm going into master's programs or I'm going specifically for PhD programs, that's also, I think, pretty welcome. And when you are selecting the schools or the programs that you apply to, you also have to think about the different types of schools that you could apply to. So there's the schools that we call safety schools. These are schools that ideally you feel quite strongly that you can get to them. So when you kind of compare your profile with the requirements and the sort of like applicants that they have accepted in the past, you feel very strongly that you have a very strong chance of getting into these programs. The target schools will be those ones that you're like, okay, aiming high to get to. So still, yes, you expect that you should be able to get into this program. And then there are those that are called rich schools. We encourage you to apply to some schools that maybe you think are a little bit beyond what you expect to get, because we also from experience know that many applicants underestimate their potential. So, I mean, don't rule out the possibility that you could get admitted to Harvard, Princeton, blah, 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 those schools that you think are beyond you. So we encourage that you balance between the safety schools that you're applying to, target schools, and rich schools. This way you improve the likelihood that you get admitted into at least one program. Yeah, so we also encourage people to apply to several programs rather than just one or two programs. So balancing between how many of the safety schools you'll apply to and how many of target schools versus how many of rich schools you'll apply to, kind of like leave it up to you, but just be aware that you shouldn't only apply to the Harvards and the Princetons, but you shouldn't also just apply to those you consider schools that you are relatively confident that you could get into, because you're likely also underestimating how great of a profile you have. Then the next phase is more of a, what we call a quantitative phase of your application. So here you have to think about standardized testing. What are the test requirements? Many universities or programs list the requirements for getting admitted into their programs. So you have to go through the websites and see what is required. Do they need a GRE? Do they need a language test? Do they need other tests? Then, of course, you have to like set your goals. What are the target scores you'd like to get for the GRE? What's the timing? When do you want to take this exam? And what are the testing dates that are available in your location? We ask you to think about these things early enough, because closer to the application deadline, many of the testing centers also get really full, and you might not be able to get a testing date, date, if you try to book a date later on. So we ask you to think about these issues early on, potentially secure a testing date early in advance, so that you don't run into the situation where you are ready to take the test, but there's no testing venues available in your location. We also have like what we call a qualitative component of your application. So building your skills. So this involves the relationship building with researchers, professors. You might already start like writing to professors who work in areas or universities that you are keenly interested in joining, or work in areas or fields that you are quite interested in working in. You can also build your skills. So for example, if you don't have a lot of skills in like coding or these sort of skills that are important for getting you admitted, then you can already start working on those skills. And then you can also work on exposing yourself to research. So it might be like reaching out to professors and really asking them, do you have any sort of work that you'd like to do? More recently, we've, as part of the GAIN, we have been also like piloting the option to allow mentors support you to work on one or several of the research makes. Then you also have to think about your personal statements. So here you're trying to tell your story beyond your CV. What are the gaps in your CV? And so you should explain this in your personal statements. Why is the school that you're applying to a good fit? This is not something that you put in your CV, but something that you put in your personal statement. Why are you applying to this particular program? And it's important for you to not have generic personal statements on why you're applying to a program. It shouldn't be one statement of purpose for all the schools that you apply to. The fabric of it could be already, I would say the skeleton of it might be something that you prepare, but you really have to adapt your personal statements depending on the school that you're applying to. Of course, you have to tell them why you think that you're a good fit for this school and why this school is a good fit for you as well. So what fields and research questions you're interested in, these are also the sort of things that you're putting in your personal statement. Sometimes you also mention which professors in those schools that you're applying to you'd be most interested in working with. It's important that you have read the work that's done by professors or rather academics in the schools that you are applying to, because then it's easy for you to connect your personal story with the work that they are doing and say, oh, actually, I like the work that's done by this professor. It resonates a lot with what I want to do. I particularly like his paper on this. It's inspired me to start working on, or rather it's inspired my interest in this specific topic. So you have to think about these sort of things when writing your personal statements. And then the last thing is the recommendation letters. These are probably the most important part of your application. Getting really strong recommendation letters, I would say, is probably the most important of all the things that you have to worry about. So really think about securing the recommendation letter writers who are going to write your letters of recommendations, but also guide your recommenders on what exactly you are thinking about for that program so that they know what they need to stress on when they're writing to your programs. Because it's also typical that recommendation letter writers write different letters to different programs that you're applying to, depending on really what's most important for that program. So securing the people who will support you in writing good recommendation letters is quite important, because I can assure you that if you have a bad recommendation letter or a recommendation letter that looks very generic, that's like one paragraph that doesn't say anything personal about you, then these are unlikely to get you admitted to the program. So you have to think about who's going to be the person that writes your recommendation letters, and their profile sometimes is also pretty important for getting you admitted into good programs. Then the second component is to secure funding, and this is mostly applicable to those who will apply to master's programs. Like I said, most of them do not come with funding. So you really have to identify scholarships, and we encourage you to have like an Excel sheet or a Google Doc where you track all scholarships for which you are eligible for. If you hear any funding or scholarship option, you want to list them in this Excel sheet, because believe me, you will forget where you saw it. So you add a list on your Google Doc, potentially a link to where you saw this, so that you have a long list of potential scholarships that you are thinking about. In this Google Doc or Excel sheet, you also want to include the deadlines, the materials that they need for the scholarship, and what are the maximum amount, because they also might guide which programs you apply to. Some programs are really, really expensive, while some are fairly affordable, the master's programs. Of course, then you have to prepare for your funding applications. Usually, scholarships also want you to have a separate statement of purpose, why exactly you think you are for the scholarship, what you're thinking about doing after concluding your studies. You need to prepare a budget narrative, and several scholarships also require that you identify references. So they expect that besides your application letters and all these skills, that you also get letters from references. They could be similar or different from your recommendation letter writers for your program application. Then the third stage, as you'd expect, is then to apply for the funding. Always remember the deadline. Get somebody to review your applications. Luckily, you will have like the mentors available to read your applications. But besides your mentors, it's really important to have another person read your application. I think it's all happened to us that you send an email, and almost as soon as you send the email, you realize that it had a typo, or there was an error in a sentence or a phrase. And these are the sort of things that get you rejected for not even for funding applications, but also for actual program applications. So you want to make sure that you have somebody that reviews your applications, to read them through, make sure that they're really well understood, and that the communication that you're trying to pass across is actually clear in the application materials. I would encourage people to apply for external funding as soon as possible. Some scholarships accept applications on rolling basis, which means, of course, then that the earlier you apply, the better. There are some that have a deadline, so they only review it afterwards. In any case, you want to apply earlier rather than later, just to avoid the pitfalls of like late deadlines. I also know another applicant who was applying to a scholarship program, and the website essentially like crashed a few hours to the deadline, but they did not extend the deadline. So you want to make sure that you're not applying very, very close to the deadline, and you're giving yourself sufficient time. We also encourage people to apply to programs with strong internal funding. So there are some programs that already have like a funding component on them. So either it might be like a full scholarship for the program or a partial scholarship for the program. We strongly encourage you to try and find these programs and to apply to these ones, rather than those that do not have any internal funding, which you have to rely on 100% external funding. So what does a sample application process timeline look like? So this is your application timeline. Like I said, it's very different depending on the program that you apply to, but for most programs, especially the standard applications, this is how the application process looks like. So between May and June, you are researching on the schools, the programs that you're applying to, the quality of the programs. You want to consider the acceptance rates. What's the mean GRE scores that these programs tend to accept. Luckily, many of the programs even have like an indication of what sort of GREs they are thinking about, or you might not find them on their website, but you might find them in other public forums where people share. You need to create a short list and set a GRE target score depending on the programs that you're applying to. And then you also need to work on solidifying your relationship with your principal investigators or the professors, or the people who will be writing your recommendation letter. So this is the period where you're trying to solidify your relationship with them, tell them that you are applying into programs, and you'd really appreciate if they write you letters of recommendation. If there's any specific work that you could do for your professor or for an academic that you work with, then this is the time to engage them and ask them, yeah, I would appreciate if you assign me tasks that will help in will help you in writing a letter. So this is the time you want to engage with them, make them aware that you are interested in applying, and ask them to assign you tasks that are quite strongly related with the sort of program that you are applying to. Between June and August, you are preparing for the GRE. It is a lot of work to prepare for the GRE. Many people leave the preparation to like the last 2 weeks of the exam. We'd encourage you to prepare for at least 3 months and have a minimum of 3 hours a day preparing for the GRE. Believe me, it might appear simple, but it's really important that you factor in enough time to prepare for the GRE. If you leave it late on, you are less likely to get a good score. We also encourage you to run like bi-weekly practice tests. There's several platforms. We will provide access to some of them where you can take practice tests. The GRE website itself offers you the possibility to take a few practice tests. If I remember correctly, it should be like 2 or 3. So it's 1 ungraded test and 2 graded tests. So I think 3 tests that you could take from the GRE website itself. But there's also several other platforms that offer mock GRE tests or even materials that have some of these tests. We encourage you that besides just revising for the GRE, you also take this test to kind of gauge where you are at with every fortnight, I would say. So in August, you probably want to take your GRE and measure the score against your target. So luckily, when you take the GRE, you get an instant score, especially on the quant and the qualitative ones, and those are probably the most important ones. Once you come out of the test, you already know what you have scored. And it's already a good measure of whether you have achieved the target that you wanted. But the importance of taking the GRE test early on in August, for example, is that in case you don't like the test results and you need to retake the GRE exam, because you can retake the GRE exam, then you have enough time to retake the exam. There is a limit. So once you take a GRE exam, you can only take another one at least 3 weeks after the test that you have taken. So you want to make sure that you have sufficient time between when you have taken your first test and the second test. So taking it early on is really important, because then you also allocate yourself an additional month to study to try and improve your test score. At this point, you also want to confirm your letter writers that they are happy to support with writing new letters of recommendation. So in August, you really should be pretty much decided on who are going to write your letters of references. Between September and October, you're already iterating your personal statement with your friends, professors, and mentors. So sending it along, getting comments, implementing them. You want to prepare a guide for each letter writer, also for the programs that you're applying to. So some programs want you to kind of like stress on different areas. You want to have a guide for each letter writer. I also encourage you to, as part of the guide, list to your letter writer all the schools or the programs that you'd like to apply to. We encourage you to apply to at least 10 programs, potentially more. So, of course, this is a lot of work for the recommendation letter writer. So you want to prepare them ahead of time, that this is how much of letters they have to write. So sending them a guide with the different programs that you're interested in applying to is quite important, so that they also anticipate. Also potentially with the deadline for each of the programs that you're applying to, so that they can already also set reminders or set on their calendars when they want to write you letters, depending on the deadline for those letters. And you have to make sure that you give them sufficient notice. I would say at least a couple of months, if possible. You do not want to ask your letter writer, oh, I'm applying to this program. The deadline for recommendation letter writers is next week. This is a bad sign that you're not prepared for that application itself. In September, you also potentially want to take the English language test if it is needed. Some programs will require you to have an English language test depending on your country and the primary language that's spoken there. Some will not. So you want to make sure that first you're aware whether this test is required for the programs that you're applying to, and you want to make sure that you take them between September and October. In November, you share your guide with your letter writers and follow up with them. Many deadlines are in November and December, by the way. So in this case, you're already checking with your letter writers whether they are on track with writing your letters. You're gathering all remaining documents. So sometimes the programs will require you to have certified copies of your transcripts and your certificates themselves. So you want to make sure that you are gathering all of these documents in anticipation for the deadline, which is why having this checklist of what is required by each program is quite important. November, of course, is then typically your last chance to take the GRE, because the deadline is looming, and anything else beyond that is already very risky. Like I mentioned, most application deadlines are in December, so you want to make sure that by December you've already submitted all of your applications. Some might spill over to January, but most, if not, most of the applications deadlines are in December. Some programs also have different deadlines. So they have a deadline. Now, this is mostly for master's programs, so you need to be aware about this. And also for some PhD programs, they will have a fast deadline for those who are interested in getting scholarship options. So when you're looking at the deadlines, don't just try to find the last deadline. Especially if you are interested in getting scholarship offers, then you really have to look out for what is the deadline for those people who are applying to get a scholarship program. If you apply beyond this deadline, you could still get admitted to the program, but you will certainly not get any scholarship or funding. So please be wary of this and take note of it when applying. So you might find several application deadlines, but usually the early deadline is for those who are interested in getting scholarship options. They also typically have early application deadlines for students who are not natives of the countries, those who require to get, for example, like visas and whatnot, you also need to be worried about this sort of deadlines, because then beyond this deadline, it's not possible for the university to process your visa application materials for you to then get a visa to arrive at the country and all that. So these are the sort of things that you need to think about when applying, and also when looking at the deadlines. Find the deadline that's appropriate for you, depending on whether you want to get scholarship options, and also be worried about deadlines for international applicants, I would say. So what are the keys to a successful application? So build strong relationships with the principal investigators and professors. Like I mentioned, I really am strongly convinced, and also out of experience, letter writers are potentially the most important component of your application. If you have a very strong letter from your professor, then this is already probably like 50% of the way, and all the other documents are really like supporting documentation. So I would say build a strong relationship with the PIs, get them to give you tasks, really try to get them to write you a good recommendation letters. But I think, I hope that this is also like obvious. Do not choose as letter writers people whom you have no idea like what they would write in your letter. Of course, this you have full autonomy on who writes your letters. So really only choose those who will write a strong letter for you. Don't choose someone whom you have some sort of doubts as to whether they would write you a good letter, because as soon as your letter has any sort of negativity, it's an unlikely accepted. So think carefully when selecting who will write your letter. Early, do your homework on the schools that you want to apply to. Get a list of the programs with what exactly they need. Have a, like I said, a list of rich school, target schools, and whatnot, just so that you have like you're diversifying your application pool, I would say. The GRE exhaust free practice material. There's a lot of free material on the website. Replicate exam day conditions when many of materials have like the GRE exams. Put yourself in a scenario in which you are in an exam, try to do this sort of test, see where you are at. It's really important for them setting the mood for how exactly you will do the test. And then it feels, when you actually take the test, it doesn't feel that different because you already sort of like mimicked this sort of scenario in your practice. Use personal statements to help the admission committee to get to know you beyond CV. You already have your CV, so don't repeat too much what is already on your resume. They can already see it there. Use the personal statement to kind of like clarify, like I said, gaps in your CV. There's personal stories that you might want to share that are actually quite important for getting the admissions committee to accept your application. And these are not the things that you put in your resume, but if you really have a personal story that you think is really important for the committee to understand why exactly you think you're a personal fit, then these are the things that you want to include in your personal statement. So use this personal statement as an addition to your resume for communicating why you think you're a good profile, and of course, why you think that the program you're applying to is a good profile for yourself. And like I said, again, provide guidance to your references to prepare effective recommendation letters. I cannot stress this enough, how important your letters of recommendation will be for your application.